I'm standing in the kitchen of our ranch house in Lakewood, Michigan, staring at my phone screen that shows three devastating words: account access denied. The morning sun streams through the gingham curtains I hung myself 2 years ago, the same curtains Margaret Mitchell told me were too country for a proper Mitchell home. My hands are trembling, not from the cold October air seeping through the old windows, but from the realization that my husband David has just cut off my access to every single bank account we share. All because yesterday at the family reunion, I finally said no to his mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, though I wasn't born with that name. I'm 35 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've been trying to become the wife that Margaret Mitchell believes her son deserves. I work as an accounting coordinator at Riverside Community College, handling budgets and financial reports for professors who barely acknowledge my existence. To the Mitchell family, I'm the girl who came from nowhere, married into their respectable hardware store legacy, and still hasn't quite learned her place. But they don't know everything about me. They never bothered to ask. The Mitchell family has owned Mitchell's hardware store in downtown Lakewood for 3 generations. It's the kind of place where locals come not just for screws and paint, but for advice on everything from leaky faucets to marriage problems. David's grandfather built the business from nothing during the Depression. His father expanded it through the boom years, and now David runs it with the steady competence that his family is known for. They're respected in this town, the kind of people who serve on the school board and organize the annual 4th of July parade. I met David 9 years ago at the community college where I work. He was taking evening classes in business management, sitting in the back row of Professor Johnson's accounting fundamentals course. I was 26 then, finally stable after years of bouncing between foster homes and working multiple jobs to pay for my own education. David was different from the guys I usually met. He was steady, reliable, and he looked at me like I was worth protecting. Our courtship was gentle and traditional. He brought me flowers every Friday, opened car doors, and introduced me to his family within 3 months. Margaret Mitchell welcomed me with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the smile that said she was evaluating whether I was good enough for her eldest son. David's father, Robert Mitchell Sr., was kinder but distant, treating me with the polite courtesy he showed all customers at the store. The Mitchell family gatherings were elaborate affairs. Every holiday, every birthday, every minor celebration became an opportunity for Margaret to demonstrate the proper way things should be done. The table settings had to be precise, the meal courses perfectly timed, and the conversation topics carefully curated to reflect the family's standing in the community. I learned quickly that my job was to observe, assist, and eventually replicate these standards in my own home. David proposed on Christmas Eve during our 2nd year together, in front of the entire family gathered around Margaret's perfectly decorated tree. The ring was his grandmother's, a modest but classic solitaire that Margaret had saved for her son's future wife. As David slipped it onto my finger, Margaret's eyes filled with tears of joy, and I felt for the first time in my life like I belonged to something permanent. Our wedding was everything Margaret dreamed of for her son. She planned most of it, from the flower arrangements to the menu, explaining that as someone who had grown up without family traditions, I wouldn't understand the importance of doing things properly. I wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried roses from her garden. David looked handsome in his grandfather's tailored suit, and when we exchanged vows in the same church where 3 generations of Mitchells had been married, I believed I was finally home. The first year of marriage was a gentle adjustment period. David was patient with my lack of domestic knowledge, teaching me his family's recipes and holiday traditions. Margaret visited twice a week, ostensibly to help me settle into married life, but really to ensure I was maintaining the Mitchell standards. She showed me how to arrange the living room furniture to facilitate conversation, how to plan meals, that would satisfy David's preferences, and how to manage our household budget in a way that reflected proper priorities. That budget management should have been my first warning sign. David handled all our finances from the beginning, explaining that as the primary breadwinner, it made sense for him to oversee our money. My paycheck from the community college was deposited into our joint account, but David managed the bill, paying, the savings allocations, and the discretionary spending. He gave me a weekly allowance for groceries and personal items, always generous enough that I never felt deprived, but controlled enough that every purchase required his implicit approval. Margaret praised this arrangement frequently. "David is so responsible with money," she would tell her friends at church. "Sarah is lucky to have a husband who takes care of all those complicated financial decisions. She can focus on making their home beautiful instead of worrying about spreadsheets and investment accounts." I told myself this was normal, even preferable. I had grown up with instability and uncertainty about money. Having David handle our finances felt secure, like having a safety net I could trust. When I wanted to buy something beyond my weekly allowance, David usually agreed readily. New clothes for work, gifts for holidays, even the occasional dinner out were never problems. He was generous and loving, and I convinced myself that questioning the arrangement would seem ungrateful. The expectations became clearer during our second year of marriage. Margaret began making more pointed suggestions about how I could better support David's career and the family's reputation in the community. I should join the church auxiliary, volunteer for the hospital fundraiser, and host dinner parties that would strengthen David's business relationships. These weren't demands exactly, but the disappointment in her voice when I hesitated made it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. I joined the auxiliary and discovered I was good at organizing events. My accounting background helped me manage budgets for fundraisers, and my natural attention to detail impressed the other women. For the first time since joining the Mitchell family, I felt like I was contributing something valuable rather than just trying to measure up to their standards. But even my successes were filtered through Margaret's expectations. When I suggested a new approach to the auxiliary's annual charity auction, Margaret smiled tightly and explained that they had been doing things the same way for 20 years because it worked. When I organized a surprisingly profitable bake sale using social media promotion, Margaret praised my effort while noting that perhaps next time we should be more discreet about our fundraising methods. David supported his mother's guidance consistently. "Mom knows how things work in this town," he would say when I occasionally expressed frustration. "She's just trying to help you understand the best way to fit in. You didn't grow up here, so you don't always see how your actions might be perceived." By our third year of marriage, I had learned to navigate the unspoken rules of being a Mitchell wife. I attended every family gathering with enthusiasm, volunteered for approved community activities, and managed our household in ways that earned Margaret's grudging approval. David and I had settled into comfortable routines, and our marriage felt stable and predictable. But I was restless in ways I couldn't quite articulate. My job at the community college was satisfying, but limited. I had learned everything there, was to know about managing departmental budgets and processing financial aid paperwork. I found myself staying late to help professors with their research grant applications, creating spreadsheets and financial projections that went far beyond my official duties. I was good at this work, better than I had ever been at arranging flowers or planning dinner parties. During my lunch breaks, I began reading financial planning magazines and business journals. I taught myself about investment strategies, small business accounting, and tax preparation. It started as idle curiosity, but gradually became a passionate interest. I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of financial systems and a talent for seeing patterns in complex data. Margaret noticed my new reading material during one of her visits and frowned with concern. "Sarah, dear, you're not thinking of going back to school, are you? David needs a wife who can focus on supporting his career, not someone distracted by her own ambitions." I assured her that I was just trying to better understand David's business, but privately, I was beginning to imagine possibilities I had never considered before. What if I could use my financial skills to build something of my own? What if I didn't have to limit myself to being the perfect Mitchell wife? The idea started small. Professor Williams in the business department mentioned that she was struggling to manage the books for her consulting practice. She worked with small businesses on marketing strategies, but had no head for numbers. I offered to help during my lunch breaks, partly as a favor and partly because I was curious about how small business accounting worked in practice. Within a month, I was managing all of Professor Williams' financial records. I created systems for tracking expenses, invoicing clients, and managing cash flow that transformed her chaotic shoebox of receipts into a well-organized business operation. She was so grateful that she insisted on paying me, despite my protests, that I was just helping a colleague. That first payment, a check for $200, felt like a revelation. I had earned money using skills I had developed independently, solving problems that mattered to someone other than the Mitchell family. I deposited the check into our joint account, as I did with all money, but I made a note of it in my personal calendar. This was something I had accomplished entirely on my own. Professor Williams recommended me to two other small business owners, both women who were struggling with bookkeeping challenges. I began spending my evenings and weekends helping them organize their finances, prepare tax documents, and create budgets that actually worked for their businesses. The work was energizing in a way that nothing else in my life had been for years. David noticed my busier schedule but didn't ask many questions. I told him I was helping some professors with special projects, which was technically true. He seemed pleased that I was staying engaged with my work at the college, and Margaret approved of what she saw as dedication to my professional responsibilities. But I was being careful not to mention the money I was earning, or the fact that my weekend errands often involved meeting with clients. Something told me that the Mitchell family's support for my accounting work would evaporate if they realized I was building what could become an independent source of income. By our 4th year of marriage, I was quietly managing the books for 6 small businesses. I had taught myself advanced accounting software, learned the intricacies of small business tax law, and developed a reputation among local entrepreneurs for being reliable and discreet. My clients paid me well for work that I genuinely enjoyed, and I was beginning to save money in ways that felt entirely separate from the Mitchell family's financial oversight. I opened a savings account at a different bank, using my maiden name and my work address. It felt like a small rebellion, but also like a necessary step toward maintaining some part of myself that belonged only to me. The account started with the payments from my bookkeeping clients, but gradually I began adding small amounts from my weekly household allowance, money saved from careful grocery shopping and thrift store finds instead of department store purchases. Margaret would have been horrified to know that I was shopping at thrift stores, but I discovered that I could dress professionally for work, spending a fraction of what she expected me to spend on clothing. The difference went into my private savings account, along with money I earned from an expanding client base that now included a catering company, a small marketing firm, and 3 independent contractors who needed help managing their quarterly taxes. David remained oblivious to the scope of my outside work. He knew I was busy with what he assumed were volunteer activities and college projects, and he seemed content with our domestic routines. We had dinner together most evenings, watched television on weekends, and maintained the social calendar that Margaret considered appropriate for a young married couple in Lakewood. But I was living a double life, and the contrast was becoming harder to ignore. During the day, I was Sarah Mitchell, dutiful wife and community college employee, deferring to Margaret's wisdom and David's financial decisions. During evenings and weekends, I was Sarah Chen's Books, the business name I had quietly registered for my growing accounting practice. I was confident, competent, and increasingly successful at work that challenged me and provided genuine satisfaction. The tension between these two versions of myself was building toward something I couldn't yet see, but I knew that the careful balance I had maintained for 4 years was becoming unsustainable. The Mitchell family expected loyalty and conformity, but I was discovering capabilities and ambitions that didn't fit within their definition of appropriate behavior for a Mitchell wife. Margaret's control over family decisions was absolute and unquestioned. She planned every holiday celebration, decided on gift exchanges, and orchestrated the elaborate family reunions that brought together Mitchell relatives from across Michigan and Ohio. David and his siblings, Kevin and Amanda, had learned early that disagreeing with their mother's plans was more trouble than it was worth. Margaret always got her way, but she did it with such apparent concern for family harmony that resistance felt selfish and ungrateful. I had learned to navigate Margaret's expectations by anticipating her preferences and avoiding situations that might create conflict. When she suggested that David and I host Easter dinner for the extended family, I agreed enthusiastically, even though our small dining room could barely seat 8 people. When she decided that Amanda's daughter should wear Margaret's christening gown for her baptism, I offered to handle the delicate restoration work even though I had no experience with antique lace. These gestures of cooperation earned me Margaret's conditional approval, but I was beginning to understand that no amount of compliance would ever make me truly acceptable in her eyes. I was always going to be the girl who married into the family, rather than someone born to Mitchell standards. My efforts to fit in were appreciated, but also seen as evidence that I needed constant guidance to avoid embarrassing the family. The annual Mitchell family reunion was Margaret's masterpiece of event planning. Every September, she coordinated a long weekend at the family's lake house on Lake Huron, where 3 generations of Mitchells gathered for boating, barbecues, and the elaborate storytelling sessions that reinforced family history and traditions. The reunion was part vacation, part performance, and entirely focused on demonstrating the success and unity of the Mitchell clan. I had attended 7 Mitchell reunions as David's wife, and each year I understood more clearly how the family dynamics worked. Margaret was the undisputed matriarch, making decisions that everyone else implemented without question. David's father, Robert Sr., provided gentle support for his wife's plans while focusing on maintaining the boats and fishing equipment. David and Kevin competed good-naturedly for their mother's approval, while Amanda navigated the complex balance between honoring family traditions and managing her own young children. The reunion conversations followed predictable patterns. The men discussed business and local politics while the women planned meals and managed children. Stories about family history were retold with reverence, emphasizing the values of hard work, community service, and family loyalty that had made the Mitchells successful. Current events were discussed in ways that reinforced the family's conservative social and political views, and any topics that might create disagreement were carefully avoided. I had learned to participate in these conversations without drawing too much attention to myself. I listened more than I spoke, asked questions that showed interest in family history, and offered to help with meal preparation and childcare duties. My accounting background made me useful for organizing group expenses and managing the reunion budget, tasks that Margaret was happy to delegate as long as she retained approval over all major decisions. But this year felt different from the moment we arrived at the lake house. Margaret seemed more focused on asserting her authority, making pointed comments about proper behavior and family responsibilities. David was more deferential than usual, agreeing quickly with his mother's suggestions and encouraging me to do the same. The atmosphere felt charged with expectations I didn't fully understand. The reunion had always included some gentle pressure about when David and I would start having children, but this year the suggestions were more direct and persistent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret made multiple comments about the importance of grandchildren for continuing the Mitchell legacy, and several relatives asked pointed questions about our family planning timeline. David seemed uncomfortable with these conversations, but didn't defend our privacy or redirect the discussion. I found myself feeling increasingly isolated as the weekend progressed. The other Mitchell wives had all grown up in similar small-town environments and shared cultural references and assumptions that I didn't always understand. Their conversations about child-rearing, community gossip, and domestic management felt foreign to me, even after 8 years of trying to fit in. I was friendly and polite, but I wasn't truly part of their inner circle. Saturday evening's family meeting was when everything began to unravel. Margaret had called it a family planning session, explaining that with the hardware store doing well and several family members reaching important life milestones, it was time to discuss how the Mitchells could better coordinate their efforts to maintain their prominent position in the community. The meeting was held in the lake house's main room, with all the adults arranged in a circle around Margaret's chair. She had prepared an agenda that covered everything from holiday celebrations to volunteer commitments to the long-term future of the family business. Each topic was presented as a collaborative discussion, but it quickly became clear that Margaret had already decided on the outcomes she wanted. The expectation that David and I would have children within the next 2 years was presented as a family goal rather than a personal decision. Margaret explained that the Mitchell name needed to be carried forward by the next generation, and that David, as the eldest son, had a particular responsibility to provide grandchildren who could eventually inherit the business and continue the family's community leadership. I felt David stiffen beside me as his mother outlined the timeline she had developed for our reproductive choices. We had discussed having children in general terms, but had never committed to any specific schedule. I had assumed that when and if we decided to start, a family would be our decision to make privately. Margaret's presentation included financial projections showing how the hardware store's profits could support an expanding family, plans for converting one of the lake house bedrooms into a nursery for summer visits, and suggestions for how I could modify my work schedule to prioritize motherhood while still contributing to family enterprises. Every part of me wanted to interrupt, to point out that these were decisions David and I needed to make together without family pressure. But I had learned that challenging Margaret's plans directly only created conflict that ultimately David would expect me to resolve by apologizing and accepting his mother's wisdom. So I sat quietly, my hands clenched in my lap, while Margaret outlined the next 5 years of my life, according to her vision of Mitchell family needs. When she finished her presentation and looked around the room for agreement, everyone nodded, approvingly except me. That silence stretched across the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret's eyes found mine, and I could see the expectation there, the assumption that I would nod along with everyone else and accept her carefully laid plans for my future. But something inside me had shifted during her presentation. Maybe it was hearing my reproductive choices discussed like a business strategy, or maybe it was the realization that I had spent 8 years of my life trying to become someone else's version of acceptable. Whatever it was, I couldn't bring myself to agree. I think David and I need to discuss this privately before making any commitments, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. The room went cold. Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment, before returning, but it was different now, sharper around the edges. Of course, dear. Though I hope you understand that family planning isn't just about personal preferences, it's about responsibility to the family legacy. David reached over and squeezed my hand, but it felt more like a warning than support. Mom's just excited about the possibility of grandchildren, he said, his voice carrying a subtle pressure. We can talk about the timeline later. But Margaret wasn't finished. Sarah, you've been part of this family for 8 years now. Surely you understand how important it is for the Mitchell name to continue. David's grandfather built this business for future generations. We can't let that legacy end because of modern selfishness. The word selfishness hit me like a slap. I had given up parts of myself I didn't even realize I was losing. I had learned to cook David's favorite meals, decorated our home according to Margaret's taste, and spent countless weekends at family events instead of pursuing my own interests. I had been careful, compliant, and grateful. But apparently, it still wasn't enough. "I'm not being selfish," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "I'm saying that having children is a decision that requires careful consideration, not a family mandate with predetermined timelines." Kevin cleared his throat uncomfortably. Amanda suddenly became very interested in her coffee cup. David's father retreated behind his newspaper. The only sound was the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock outside. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "I see. Well, I suppose some people need more time to understand their obligations." She turned to David with a look that clearly communicated her disappointment in his choice of wife. "Perhaps you could help Sarah appreciate what it means to be part of a family that builds legacies instead of just living for the moment." The rest of the evening passed in strained politeness. Conversations continued around me, but I felt like I was watching everything through glass. David avoided eye contact, and I could sense his frustration building. When we finally retreated to our bedroom in the lake house's upper level, the tension that had been simmering all day finally erupted. "What was that about?" David demanded as soon as he closed the door. "Mom spent weeks planning this discussion, and you just shut her down in front of everyone." "She was planning our children like a business expansion," I shot back. "When did our family decisions become committee votes?" David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of managing stress. "She's not planning anything. She's just trying to help us think about the future responsibly. You grew up without family support, so maybe you don't understand how these conversations work." There it was again, the subtle reminder that I was an outsider who needed guidance to navigate normal family relationships. "I understand perfectly," I said. "Your mother wants to control when we have children, how many we have, and probably what we name them. That's not family support, David. That's manipulation." "That's not fair," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mom just wants what's best for our family." "What's best for her version of our family," I corrected. "What about what we want? What about what I want?" David sat heavily on the bed, suddenly looking older than his 38 years. "What do you want, Sarah? Because sometimes I feel like you're not really here, like you're just going through the motions of being my wife." His words stung because they contained a grain of truth I wasn't ready to examine. I had been going through motions, playing a role that felt increasingly foreign to who I was becoming. But instead of admitting that, I deflected. "I want to make decisions about our life together, not have them made for us by your mother." "She's trying to help," David insisted, but the argument was losing steam. We both knew this wasn't really about Margaret's family planning presentation. It was about something deeper, something that had been building for years. We went to bed angry that night, lying on opposite sides of the mattress with a wall of unspoken resentments between us. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the lake water, and wondering when I had become someone I barely recognized. Somewhere, in the process of trying to be the perfect Mitchell wife, I had lost track of who Sarah actually was underneath all the accommodations and adjustments. The next morning brought fresh tension disguised as normal family activities. Margaret was coldly polite, speaking to me only when necessary and directing most of her attention toward David and the other family members. I could feel the weight of her disapproval in every interaction, the subtle way she excluded me from conversations and decision-making. During the traditional Sunday morning boat ride, I found myself sitting alone at the back of the vessel while the rest of the family clustered around Margaret at the front. David was absorbed in a conversation with his father about expanding the hardware store, and I realized that he had unconsciously chosen his family's side in our conflict. I wasn't being punished exactly, but I was being reminded of my place in the family hierarchy. The isolation gave me time to think, and what I thought about was my secret savings account and the growing success of my bookkeeping business. While Margaret was lecturing me about family obligations, I was quietly building something that could give me real independence. The contrast felt surreal. In one world, I was a disappointing daughter-in-law who couldn't appreciate her proper role. In the other, I was a competent professional who solved complex financial problems for grateful clients. That afternoon, while the family napped or read on the lake house deck, I drove into the nearby town of Bay City under the pretense of getting groceries. Instead, I visited the small office space I had been renting for the past 6 months. It was nothing fancy, just a converted storefront with a desk, filing cabinets, and a reliable internet connection. But it was mine in a way that nothing else in my life was. I had told David that I occasionally met clients at coffee shops or the college library, which was true in the beginning. But as my business grew, I needed a more professional setting for meetings and a secure place to store client files. The office rent was modest, easily covered by my growing income, and the space gave me a base of operations that felt completely separate from my life as a Mitchell. Sitting at my desk that Sunday afternoon, I reviewed the financial projections I had been working on for the past month. My client base had grown to 12 small businesses, and I was earning nearly as much from my accounting practice as I did from my job at the community college. More importantly, I was building relationships with entrepreneurs and business owners who valued my expertise and treated me as an equal partner in their success. One of my newest clients was a woman named Jessica Martinez who had started a catering business from her home kitchen. When we first met, Jessica was overwhelmed by the financial requirements of converting her hobby into a legitimate business. She had talent and determination, but no understanding of business licenses, tax obligations, or cash flow management. Over the past 3 months, I had helped Jessica navigate the bureaucratic requirements of starting a food service business, set up accounting systems that tracked her costs and profits accurately, and create financial projections that helped her secure a small business loan. Her gratitude was genuine, and her respect for my abilities was evident in every interaction we had. The contrast with my family relationships was stark. Jessica saw me as an expert whose advice could make the difference between success and failure for her business. Margaret saw me as a project that required constant correction and guidance. Jessica paid me well for services that utilized my strongest skills. Margaret expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to learn proper domestic management. I was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't my inability to appreciate the Mitchell family values. The problem was that those values required me to minimize my own capabilities in order to fit into their predetermined roles for wives and daughters-in-law. I could be helpful and supportive, but I couldn't be independently successful without threatening the family's established hierarchy. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. If I acknowledged that I had outgrown the role of dutiful Mitchell wife, what came next? David and I had built our marriage around certain assumptions about who we were and what we wanted from life. If those assumptions were wrong, what did that mean for our future? The drive back to the lake house gave me time to consider my options. I could apologize to Margaret, accept her family planning timeline, and continue playing the role that kept peace in the Mitchell household. It would be easier in the short term, and it would preserve the stability that David valued above almost everything else. Or I could continue building my business and my independence, knowing that it would eventually create a crisis that David and his family wouldn't be able to ignore. The thought was both exciting and frightening. I had never been the kind of person who created conflict intentionally, but I was starting to realize that avoiding conflict might be costing me more than I was willing to pay. When I returned to the lake house, the family was gathered on the deck for the traditional Sunday evening barbecue. David was manning the grill while Margaret supervised the preparation of side dishes, and Kevin organized games for the children. It was a picture of domestic harmony, and I could see how my absence had allowed everyone to relax into their familiar roles without the tension my presence had been creating. "Sarah," Amanda called out with forced cheerfulness, "we were wondering where you'd gone. Did you find everything you needed in town?" "Just picked up a few things," I replied vaguely, not wanting to explain my real destination. "Can I help with anything?" Margaret looked up from the potato salad she was arranging. Everything's under control, dear. Why don't you just sit and relax? The dismissal was polite but clear. I wasn't needed for the meal preparation, and my offer to help was being declined. I sat in one of the deck chairs and watched my husband's family work together with the easy coordination of people who had been doing this for decades. They moved around each other gracefully, anticipating needs and sharing tasks without discussion. I realized that I would never be part of that seamless cooperation, no matter how hard I tried or how many years I spent learning their routines. I would always be the add-on, the person who needed directions and supervision because I hadn't grown up understanding how things were supposed to work. The revelation wasn't bitter exactly, but it was final. I had spent 8 years trying to earn a place in this family that was never really available to me. I could be tolerated, accommodated, and even appreciated for specific contributions, but I would never be trusted with real authority or treated as an equal decision-maker. David joined me after getting the burgers started, settling into the chair beside mine with a beer and a tentative smile. "Good day?" he asked, clearly hoping that some time away had improved my mood. "Productive," I answered honestly. "I got some work done." He nodded without asking for details, which was typical. David had never shown much interest in the specifics of my job at the community college or my volunteer work with local businesses. As long as I was occupied and not causing family drama, he was content to let me manage my own schedule. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice so the rest of the family couldn't hear. "About last night and this morning. Mom's feelings were hurt by how you responded to her suggestions. Maybe when we get home you could give her a call and smooth things over?" I looked at my husband, this man I had loved and married and tried to build a life with, and felt something shift inside me. He wasn't asking me to stand up for our right to make private decisions about our future. He wasn't questioning whether his mother's expectations were reasonable or appropriate. He was asking me to apologize for not being sufficiently grateful for her interference in our marriage. "What if I don't want to smooth things over?" I asked quietly. David's face tightened with anxiety. "Sarah, she's my mother. She's been nothing but welcoming to you since the day we met. The least you can do is show her some respect." "I do respect her," I said, which was partially true. "But respect doesn't mean accepting her control over our personal decisions." She's not trying to control anything," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just excited about the possibility of grandchildren. Is it so wrong for her to express that?" "Expressing excitement is different from creating timelines and making financial projections," I pointed out. She presented our reproductive choices like a business plan that required board approval. David was quiet for a long moment, watching his mother arrange serving dishes with military precision. "That's just how she processes things," he said, finally. "She likes to plan and organize. It doesn't mean she expects us to follow her schedule exactly." But we both knew that wasn't true. Margaret's suggestions were always presented with the expectation of compliance, and disagreement was treated as evidence of poor judgment or insufficient family loyalty. David had learned long ago that the path of least resistance was to accept his mother's guidance and trust that her experience would lead to better outcomes than his own decision-making. The pattern had worked for him throughout his childhood and young adulthood, but it was becoming increasingly problematic in our marriage. I wasn't his sibling or cousin, content to defer to Margaret's wisdom about family matters. I was his wife, with my own opinions and priorities that didn't always align with the Mitchell family's established traditions. As the evening progressed, I felt like I was watching our family dynamics from the outside. The conversations flowed around familiar topics, the laughter came at predictable moments, and everyone seemed comfortable with their assigned roles in the family structure. Everyone except me. I found myself thinking about Jessica Martinez and her catering business, about the confidence in her voice when she called to update me on her latest success, about the way she treated my advice as valuable expertise rather than helpful amateur assistance. I thought about my other clients, business owners who respected my judgment and paid me well for services that made real differences in their lives. Tomorrow, I would return to Lakewood and resume my dual existence. Sarah Mitchell would report to work at the community college, manage her household according to proper standards, and avoid creating conflict with her mother-in-law. Sarah Chen's books would continue building a reputation for excellence, expanding her client base, and accumulating savings that represented real independence. But tonight, sitting on this deck surrounded by David's family, I was beginning to understand that the two versions of myself were becoming incompatible. I could no longer pretend that I was satisfied with the role of supportive wife and grateful daughter-in-law. I had tasted something different, something that felt more authentic and fulfilling than anything I had experienced in 8 years of marriage. The question was whether I had the courage to choose authenticity over security, independence over acceptance, and whether David would be able to understand and support that choice, or if it would ultimately cost me everything I had built with the Mitchell family. The drive home Monday morning was quiet, with David focused on the road and classic rock playing softly on the radio. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar Michigan landscape, trying to process everything that had happened during the reunion weekend. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded with unresolved tension and unspoken questions about our future. "So," David said as we turned onto our street, "what's your schedule like this week?" It was a normal question, the kind of casual conversation we had been having for years, but something about it felt different now, more loaded with implications. I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. "Pretty busy," I replied honestly. "I have 3 client meetings scheduled, plus the usual work at the college." David nodded absently as he pulled into our driveway. "Client meetings?" The question was casual, but I realized I had never been specific about my bookkeeping work in ways that might reveal how extensive it had become. David knew I helped some professors and local businesses with financial projects, but he didn't know about my office space, my growing client base, or the substantial income I was generating. "Just some small business owners who need help with their books," I said, which was true but incomplete. We carried our bags inside and began the familiar routine of unpacking and settling back into our normal schedule. David checked messages on the answering machine while I started a load of laundry and sorted through the mail that had accumulated over the weekend. It was ordinary and domestic, but I felt like I was going through the motions of being someone else. That evening, David brought up the family reunion conversation again, but from a different angle. "I talked to Mom while you were getting groceries yesterday," he said as we cleaned up after dinner. "She's really concerned that you're not happy, being part of our family." I stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you're still adjusting to our family traditions, that it takes time to understand how we do things." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "But honestly, Sarah, I'm starting to wonder if that's really the issue." "What do you mean?" David leaned against the kitchen island, his expression serious. "I mean, maybe the problem isn't that you don't understand our family. Maybe the problem is that you don't want to be part of it." The accusation hung in the air between us. It was both unfair and uncomfortably close to the truth. I did want to be part of a loving family, but I was no longer sure I could be part of this particular family on the terms they required. "That's not true," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" David pressed. "When was the last time you seemed genuinely happy at a family gathering? When was the last time you showed real enthusiasm for our traditions or our plans for the future?" He was right, and we both knew it. I had been going through the motions for months, maybe years, participating without truly engaging. But his analysis missed the crucial point about why that was happening. "I've been trying to fit into roles that don't really fit me," I said carefully. "Your family has very specific ideas about how wives and daughters-in-law should behave, and those ideas don't leave much room for who I actually am. Who you actually are. David's voice carried a note of frustration. Sarah, you've been part of this family for 8 years. If you're still not comfortable with who you are maybe the problem isn't with us. The conversation was spiraling toward accusations and defensiveness, the kind of argument that would end with hurt feelings and unresolved issues. I took a deep breath and tried a different approach. David, do you know what I do during my client meetings? He looked puzzled by the change of subject. You help people with their bookkeeping, right? I do comprehensive financial consulting for 12 small businesses, I said. I help them with tax planning, cash flow analysis, business expansion strategies, and investment decisions. I've helped 3 companies secure bank loans, saved 2 others from bankruptcy, and increased the profitability of every client I work with. David stared at me. 12 businesses? I have an office in Bay City. I'm earning almost as much from consulting as I do from my job at the college. I have clients who drive from Grand Rapids to meet with me because they trust my expertise. The silence stretched between us as David processed this information. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you would want to discuss it with your mother, I said honestly. Because I knew she would have opinions about whether it was appropriate for a Mitchell wife to have an independent business. Because I needed something that was mine. David sat down heavily at the kitchen table. How long has this been going on? 3 years, I admitted. It started small, just helping a few professors. But it grew because I'm good at it, David. I'm really good at something that has nothing to do with being your wife or your mother's daughter-in-law. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was hurt and confused. 3 years of lying to me. 3 years of not telling you everything, I corrected. There's a difference. Is there? He asked. Sarah, we're married. We're supposed to be partners. How can we be partners if you're keeping major parts of your life secret from me? It was a fair question, but it was also missing the point. How can we be partners if every decision I make has to be approved by your mother first? How can we be partners if I'm expected to give up my own goals and ambitions to support your family's expectations? David shook his head. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Isn't it? I challenged. This weekend, your mother laid out a 5-year plan for our reproductive choices. She's been managing our social calendar since we got married. She has opinions about how I dress, what I cook, and how I spend my free time. And you support all of it because it's easier than setting boundaries with her. She's trying to help, David said, but the words sounded automatic, like a response he'd been giving for so long that he no longer examined its truth. She's trying to control, I replied, and I'm tired of pretending that's the same thing. We went to bed that night with more unresolved tension between us than we'd ever had in our marriage. David was hurt by my secrecy, and I was frustrated by his inability to see how his mother's involvement in our relationship had created the conditions that made secrecy necessary. But something had shifted. I had finally told David about my business, about the success I had been building independently, about the parts of myself that I had been keeping hidden. The conversation hadn't gone well, but it was a beginning. The next morning, David left for work without his usual goodbye kiss, and I knew that our marriage had entered a new phase. We couldn't go back to the comfortable routines that had carried us through the past 8 years. Too much had been revealed. Too many assumptions had been challenged. I had a choice to make. I could try to repair the damage by scaling back my business, apologizing to Margaret, and returning to my role as the dutiful Mitchell wife. Or I could continue building the independence I had been creating in secret, knowing that it might ultimately cost me my marriage. As I got ready for work that morning, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and tried to see clearly who I had become. I was no longer the grateful young woman who had been so relieved to find stability and acceptance in the Mitchell family. I was someone with skills, ambitions, and the ability to build something meaningful on my own terms. The question was whether David could learn to love and respect this version of me, or if his loyalty to his family's expectations would ultimately prove stronger than his commitment to our marriage. I was about to find out which mattered more to him, the wife I had been trying to be, or the woman I was finally becoming. The week following our confrontation felt like living in a house made of eggshells. David left for work each morning with barely a word, and I could hear him on the phone with his mother during his lunch breaks, their conversations muffled behind the closed door of his home office. I continued my routine of working at the college, during the day and meeting with clients in the evenings, but the comfortable compartmentalization of my double life had been shattered. Margaret called me directly on Wednesday afternoon, something she rarely did unless David was unavailable. Her voice was carefully controlled when I answered the phone, the tone she used when she was managing a difficult situation that required delicate handling. "Sarah, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting your work at the college." "Not at all," I replied, settling into my desk chair and bracing myself for whatever conversation she had planned. "I've been thinking about our discussion over the weekend, and I realize I may have been a bit too enthusiastic about family planning. Sometimes I get carried away when I'm excited about the future." Her words were measured, clearly rehearsed. "I hope you'll forgive an old woman for being too eager for grandchildren." The apology was skillfully crafted to sound humble while actually reinforcing her position. She wasn't sorry for trying to control our reproductive choices. She was sorry for being too obvious about it. The subtext was clear. She expected me to apologize in return for being unreasonably resistant to her perfectly reasonable excitement. "I appreciate that, Margaret," I said carefully. "I think we all want the same things ultimately. We just have different ideas about timing and process." "Exactly," she said, her voice warming with what sounded like genuine relief. "That's why I was hoping we could have lunch this week. Just the two of us to clear the air and talk about how we can better support each other moving forward." The invitation was phrased as a reconciliation gesture, but I recognized it as something else entirely. Margaret was concerned about losing control over our family dynamics, and she was implementing damage control. A private lunch would give her the opportunity to assess how serious my resistance was and develop strategies for managing it. "That sounds lovely," I said, because refusing would only confirm her suspicions that I was becoming genuinely problematic rather than just temporarily difficult. We arranged to meet Friday at the Lakewood Country Club, where Margaret held a membership that she used primarily for business entertaining and social positioning. It was neutral territory where she would be comfortable and confident, surrounded by the kind of people who reinforced her worldview and social status. That evening, David came home from work with Chinese takeout and a tentative olive branch. "Mom called," he said as he unpacked containers of sweet and sour chicken and fried rice. "She wants to have lunch with you this week." "I know. We're meeting Friday." David nodded, clearly relieved that I had agreed to the meeting. "She feels bad about how things went at the reunion. She really does just want what's best for our family." I had heard this refrain so many times that I could have recited it myself. Margaret always wanted what was best for the family, which conveniently always aligned with what Margaret wanted for herself. But pointing this out would only restart the argument we'd been having all week. "I'm sure she does," I said instead, focusing on dividing the fried rice between our plates. "Maybe this is a chance to start fresh," David suggested, his voice carrying the hope of someone who desperately wanted the conflict in his life to simply disappear. "You two have always gotten along before. I'm sure you can work this out." We had never really gotten along, I realized. We had established a functional détente based on my willingness to defer to Margaret's expectations and her willingness to tolerate my presence in the family. But that wasn't the same thing as actually liking or respecting each other. David seemed to take my silence as agreement, and dinner passed in relatively peaceful conversation about his day at the hardware store and my work at the college. We were both carefully avoiding the topics that had created so much tension, but the avoidance felt artificial and temporary. We were postponing a reckoning, not preventing it. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Michigan that matched my mood as I drove to the country club. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blazer and gray slacks that were professional enough to command respect, but conservative enough to avoid criticism. I wanted to look competent without appearing threatening, successful without seeming to challenge Margaret's authority. The Lakewood Country Club was exactly what I expected. Understated elegance designed to signal wealth and status without being ostentatious. Margaret was already seated at a corner table in the dining room when I arrived, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She rose to greet me with the kind of embrace that looked warm to observers, but felt coolly calculated. "You look lovely, dear," she said as we settled into our seats. "That blazer is very flattering. Is it new?" "Thank you. I've had it for a while." I didn't mention that I had bought it at a consignment shop in Bay City for $15, though I suspected Margaret's trained eye had already assessed its quality and probable origin. We ordered lunch and made small talk about the weather, the fall foliage, and the upcoming church fundraiser. Margaret was an expert at social conversation, smoothly guiding the discussion through safe topics while she evaluated my mood and receptiveness. I played along, knowing that the real conversation would come once we had established the proper atmosphere. "I've been thinking quite a lot about our conversation last weekend," Margaret said finally, setting down her water glass and fixing me with the kind of direct gaze that had intimidated me for years. "I realize that I may have come across as pushy about the grandchildren issue." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, though I noticed she was still framing her interference as an issue of presentation rather than appropriateness. "The thing is, Sarah, I've watched you struggle to find your place in our family for 8 years now. I've tried to help and guide you, but sometimes I wonder if my efforts are actually making things harder for you." This was a more sophisticated approach than I had expected. Instead of defending her behavior or demanding my compliance, Margaret was positioning herself as someone who was concerned about my happiness and well-being. It was clever and probably effective with most people. "I have struggled sometimes," I admitted carefully. "Coming from my background, it took time to understand how close-knit families operate." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "Exactly. And I think part of the problem is that David and I have been so focused on helping you adapt to our family traditions that we haven't taken enough time to understand what you need to feel truly fulfilled." The conversation was taking an unexpected turn. I had prepared for confrontation or manipulation, but Margaret was offering something that sounded almost like compromise. "What I mean is," she continued, "perhaps we've been so concerned with including you in family activities that we haven't encouraged you enough to pursue your own interests and goals." My pulse quickened. David had clearly told his mother about my business, and she was now attempting to address it in a way that maintained her authority while appearing supportive. "I do have some outside interests," I said cautiously. "Yes, David mentioned that you've been doing some consulting work with local businesses." "That's wonderful, dear. I think it's important for women to have intellectual challenges beyond domestic responsibilities." The patronizing tone was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret was willing to tolerate my business activities as long as they remained subordinate to my primary role as David's wife and her daughter-in-law. "It has been fulfilling," I agreed. "I enjoy helping small business owners solve financial problems." "I'm sure you do. And I think it's marvelous that you're using your education in practical ways." Margaret paused to take a sip of her tea. "Of course, as your family grows, you'll probably need to scale back some of those outside commitments. But for now, while it's just you and David, there's no reason you can't pursue these little projects." There it was, the real message delivered with sugarcoating. My business was acceptable as a temporary hobby, something to keep me occupied until I started producing grandchildren and could focus on my real responsibilities. Actually, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, my consulting practice has grown quite a bit. I have 12 regular clients now, and I'm earning substantial income from the work. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. How nice. Though I hope you're not overextending yourself. David needs a wife who can prioritize their relationship and family obligations. I think I've been doing that for 8 years, I replied. I've attended every family gathering, participated in every tradition, and supported David's career consistently. I think I've earned the right to pursue my own professional goals as well. Of course you have, dear. No one is questioning your dedication to the family. Margaret's tone remained pleasant, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. I'm just concerned that you might be taking on more than you can handle effectively. Running a business is quite demanding, and marriage requires a certain level of attention and energy. The implication was clear. I couldn't be a good wife and a successful businesswoman simultaneously. I had to choose, and Margaret was confident that she knew which choice was correct. Many women manage both successfully, I pointed out. David's business demands plenty of his attention and energy, but no one questions his ability to be a good husband. That's different, and you know it, Margaret said, her pleasant facade slipping slightly. Men are expected to provide for their families financially. Women who choose to marry have different responsibilities. What if I don't agree with those traditional role divisions? The question hung between us like a challenge. Margaret set down her fork and looked at me with the kind of cold assessment I had seen her use on suppliers who were trying to negotiate unfavorable contracts with the hardware store. Sarah, I'm going to be very direct with you because I think our family has reached a point where clarity is more important than politeness. Her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge. You married into the Mitchell family with certain expectations on both sides. We expected you to embrace our values and traditions, and you expected us to provide you with security and belonging. I said nothing, sensing that she was building toward something significant. For 8 years, we've all tried to make this arrangement work. But lately, I get the impression that you're no longer satisfied with your side of the bargain. You seem to want the benefits of being a Mitchell wife without accepting the responsibilities that come with that position. What responsibilities are those exactly? I asked. Supporting your husband's career and reputation in the community. Maintaining family traditions. Prioritizing family needs over personal ambitions. Contributing to the next generation. Margaret's voice was matter of fact, as if she were reading from a job description. These aren't unreasonable expectations, Sarah. They're the foundation of successful families. And what if I have different ideas about what makes a successful family? Margaret smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then perhaps you married into the wrong family. The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had just told me, in the politest possible terms, that I could conform to the Mitchell family expectations, or I could leave. There was no third option, no possibility of negotiation or compromise. I see, I said quietly. I hope you do, Margaret replied, because David is a good man who deserves a wife who supports his goals and values. If you can't be that person, then the kindest thing you could do is acknowledge that and step aside so he can find someone who can. The threat was delivered with perfect composure, but it was unmistakably a threat. Margaret was telling me that my marriage was conditional on my compliance with her vision of appropriate behavior. She was also implying that if I continued to resist her authority, she would work to convince David that our marriage was a mistake. Does David know you're having this conversation with me? I asked. David knows that I love him and want him to be happy, Margaret said. He also knows that I have more experience than either of you in understanding what makes marriages work long term. I realized that this lunch had never been about reconciliation or compromise. It was about Margaret reasserting control over her family dynamics by making clear that my continued membership in the family was contingent on my submission to her authority. She had tried gentler methods of management for 8 years, but my resistance at the reunion had convinced her that stronger measures were necessary. "I need to think about what you've said," I told her. "Of course, dear. These are important decisions that shouldn't be rushed." Margaret signaled for the check, with the confidence of someone who believed she had successfully concluded a difficult negotiation. "I just want you to understand that David's happiness is my priority, as it should be yours." The drive back to my office in Bay City gave me time to process what had just happened. Margaret had essentially given me an ultimatum: submit to her, control, or lose my marriage. She had done it with perfect politeness and apparent concern for everyone's well-being, but the message was unmistakable. What she didn't know was that she had also given me clarity about my situation that I hadn't been able to achieve on my own. I had been trying to find a way to maintain my marriage while building my independence, hoping that gradual change would be less threatening than dramatic confrontation. But Margaret had made it clear that any level of independence was unacceptable if it challenged her authority over family decisions. I sat in my office that afternoon, staring at my client files and financial records, trying to imagine what my life would look like if I chose compliance over autonomy. I could scale back my business, apologize for my resistance, and return to the role of grateful daughter-in-law who deferred to Margaret's wisdom. David would be relieved, the family tensions would ease, and I could probably maintain a stable, if unfulfilling, marriage. But I would also be giving up everything I had built over the past 3 years. I would be abandoning clients who depended on my expertise and returning to a life where my primary value was my willingness to minimize myself for other people's comfort. The alternative was to continue building my business and my independence, knowing that it would likely cost me my marriage to David. Margaret would work to convince him that I was selfish and ungrateful, that I had violated the fundamental agreements that made our marriage possible. She would probably succeed, because David had never learned to question his mother's judgment about what was best for the family. As I reviewed my business accounts that afternoon, I realized that the choice wasn't really about David or Margaret, or even my marriage. It was about who I wanted to be and what kind of life I wanted to live. I had spent 8 years trying to become someone else's version of acceptable, and it had nearly erased the person I actually was underneath all the adaptations and accommodations. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. It was Jessica Martinez, my catering client, calling with exciting news about a contract she had just secured for a series of corporate events. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for helping me structure the financial projections for this proposal," she said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. The client was so impressed with the professional presentation that they're talking about expanding the contract to include their sister companies. As I listened to Jessica describe her success and credit my contribution to it, I felt something settle into place inside me. This was who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else. I was competent, valuable, and capable of building something meaningful through my own efforts. I had been thinking about Margaret's ultimatum as a choice between my marriage and my business, but I was beginning to understand that it was really a choice between 2 completely different versions of myself. I could be the grateful Mitchell wife who found fulfillment through supporting other people's goals, or I could be the independent professional who built her own success and helped others do the same. That evening, David came home with flowers and a bottle of wine, clearly hoping that my lunch with his mother had resolved our family tensions. "How did it go?" he asked as he arranged the roses in a vase. "It was enlightening," I said honestly. "Good. I'm sure you two can work things out. Mom really does want what's best for everyone." I looked at my husband, this man I had loved and tried to build a life with, and realized that he genuinely believed what he was saying. In his world, Margaret's control felt like loving guidance, and resistance to that control felt like selfishness and ingratitude. "David," I said carefully, "what would you do if you had to choose between your mother's approval and my happiness?" He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "I don't think it should come down to that kind of choice. If we all communicate better and try to understand each other's perspectives, we should be able to find solutions that work for everyone. But what if we can't? What if your mother's idea of what's best for our family is fundamentally incompatible with what I need to be happy and fulfilled?" David set down the wine bottle and looked at me with growing concern. "Sarah, what exactly did you and Mom talk about today?" I could tell him the truth about Margaret's ultimatum, but I realized it wouldn't change anything fundamental about our situation. David would be upset that his mother had been so direct, but he wouldn't question whether her underlying expectations were reasonable. He would ask us both to compromise without understanding that Margaret had already made clear that compromise wasn't an option. "We talked about expectations," I said instead. "About what it means to be part of the Mitchell family and whether I'm capable of meeting those expectations. And I think your mother has some legitimate concerns about whether I'm the right fit for this family." David's face went pale. "What does that mean?" "It means I need to decide whether I can be the wife you need me to be, or whether it would be better for everyone if I stepped aside so you could find someone who could." The words were Margaret's, but as I spoke them, I realized they contained a truth I hadn't been willing to acknowledge. I couldn't be the wife David needed me to be, not if that meant accepting Margaret's control over our major life decisions. And David couldn't be the husband I needed him to be, not if that meant choosing my autonomy over his family's approval. We were approaching a crisis that would require one of us to fundamentally change who we were, and neither of us seemed capable of that kind of transformation. The question was, which one of us would be strong enough to acknowledge that reality first? 3 days later, Margaret called David at work with news that would accelerate our timeline considerably. The hardware store had received an offer from a regional chain that wanted to acquire local businesses in small Michigan towns. The offer was substantial enough to provide comfortable retirement for David's parents and significant capital for David to start his own business or pursue other opportunities. But the sale would also mean major changes for our family's position in Lakewood. The Mitchell name would no longer be associated with the town's primary hardware store, and David would need to establish a new professional identity and source of income. According to Margaret, these changes made it even more important for David to have a stable family situation that could provide emotional and social support during the transition. The subtext was obvious. This was not the time for David to be dealing with a wife who was questioning family values and pursuing independent business interests. Margaret needed to know that our family unit was solid and reliable before she could recommend that David's father accept the acquisition offer. When David told me about the situation that evening, I could see the excitement in his eyes despite his attempt to appear cautious and thoughtful. The sale would give him financial freedom to pursue opportunities he had only dreamed about, and the chance to step out from under his father's shadow in the family business. "What do you think?" he asked after explaining the details of the offer. "I think it sounds like an amazing opportunity," I said honestly. "You've always talked about wanting to try something different, and this would give you the capital to do it. But it would also mean a lot of changes. We'd need to think carefully about how to maintain our position in the community, maybe get more involved in civic organizations to establish new networks." I could hear Margaret's influence in his words. She was already planning how the family would navigate the social and professional implications of selling the business, and those plans clearly involved traditional approaches to community engagement and family presentation. "Have you thought about what kind of business you'd want to start?" I asked. David's face lit up. "Actually, I've been thinking about this for months. There's a growing market for renovation and restoration services, especially for older homes. I could combine my knowledge of hardware and construction with design services, maybe partner with architects and interior designers." It was the most animated I had seen him in years. David had real vision and expertise that could translate into a successful independent business, and the sale of the hardware store would give him the resources to make it happen. "That sounds perfect for you," I said. "You know construction. You understand customer service, and you have connections throughout the region." "The thing is," David continued, his enthusiasm dimming slightly, "it would be important to present the right image from the beginning. Potential clients need to see stability and professionalism, a successful family man with traditional values." There it was again, the assumption that his success depended on maintaining certain appearances, including a wife who fit the appropriate mold. Margaret had clearly been coaching him on how to think about the business opportunity, and those thoughts included specific expectations about my role in supporting his new venture. "What would that mean for me?" I asked. "Well, you'd probably need to step back from some of your outside commitments to focus on supporting the business launch, networking events, client entertainment, that kind of thing. Mom thinks you could be really valuable in helping establish relationships with potential customers, especially if we're targeting the upscale market." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Margaret's plan involved not just ending my independent business, but conscripting me into a supporting role for David's new venture. I would go from being an autonomous professional to being an unpaid marketing assistant whose primary job was to make David look successful and stable. "What about my consulting work?" I asked. David's expression grew uncomfortable. "I think you'd probably need to wind that down. Starting a new business requires total focus, and we'd need to present a united front to potential clients and investors." "Wind it down," I repeated. "Well, yes. I mean, you could probably keep 1 or 2 clients if you wanted, but the bulk of your time would need to be available for supporting the new business." I stared at my husband, trying to process what he was asking me to do. He wanted me to abandon the work that had given me purpose and independence, give up the clients who respected my expertise, and transform myself into a corporate wife whose primary function was to enhance his professional image. "David," I said slowly, "my consulting business is successful. I have 12 clients who depend on me. I can't just walk away from those commitments." "Of course not immediately," he said, clearly thinking he was being reasonable. "You'd give proper notice and help them transition to other services. But Sarah, this is a chance for us to build something really significant together. Something that could set us up for the rest of our lives." "Something that you would build," I corrected. "I'd just be the supportive wife in the background." David looked genuinely confused by my resistance. "That's not fair. You'd be a full partner in the business. Your role would just be different from mine." "What kind of partnership involves one person giving up their existing career to support the other person's dreams?" "The kind that builds successful families," David said, and I could hear Margaret's words in his voice. "Sarah, I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. This is an incredible opportunity for our future." "For your future," I said. "What about mine?" We stared at each other across the kitchen table, 2 people who had somehow arrived at completely incompatible visions of what our life together should look like. David saw an opportunity for us to build something significant together, but his definition of together required me to subordinate my goals to his. I saw a demand that I sacrifice everything I had worked to build in order to play a supporting role in his success story. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. David nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. "Don't take too long. Dad needs an answer about the sale by the end of next week, and our decision affects whether he accepts the offer." As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while David slept beside me, I realized that Margaret had been more strategic than I had given her credit for. She hadn't just given me an ultimatum about conforming to family expectations. She had engineered a situation where my resistance to those expectations would directly impact the family's financial future. If I refused to give up my business and support David's new venture in the way Margaret deemed appropriate, I wouldn't just be defying her authority. I would be preventing David from pursuing his dreams and potentially costing his family a significant financial opportunity. The pressure was expertly applied and nearly irresistible. What kind of wife would put her own career ambitions ahead of her husband's once-in-a-lifetime chance for success? What kind of daughter-in-law would jeopardize the family's financial security because she couldn't accept appropriate role divisions? But as I lay there in the darkness, I found myself thinking not about what kind of wife or daughter-in-law I was supposed to be, but about what kind of person I wanted to be. And I realized that the answer to that question was going to determine everything that happened next. The decision crystallized on Thursday morning when I received a phone call. That changed everything. I was at my desk at the community college, reviewing budget reports for the science department, when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something prompted me to answer. Sarah Mitchell? The voice was professional, crisp. This is Sarah. My name is Patricia Hoffman. I'm a partner at Hoffman Sterling & Associates, a financial consulting firm in Grand Rapids. I've been hearing remarkable things about your work with small businesses in the Bay City area. I sat up straighter, my full attention focused on the call. Oh? Ike's. One of our clients, Martinez Catering, recently secured a significant contract with our firm for corporate events. When we complimented Jessica Martinez on her exceptional financial planning and presentation, she gave us your name as her business consultant. My heart began racing. Jessica hadn't mentioned recommending me to a major consulting firm. Jessica spoke very highly of the comprehensive financial restructuring you did for her business, Patricia continued. She said you transformed her operation from a struggling startup into a profitable enterprise with clear growth strategies and impressive cash flow management. Jessica is a talented entrepreneur, I managed to say. I just helped her organize her numbers to reflect the strength of her business model. Modest and effective, I like that. Patricia's voice carried a note of approval. Here's why I'm calling. We have a client, a mid-sized manufacturing company that's struggling with some complex financial challenges. They need someone who can analyze their operations, identify inefficiencies, and develop a restructuring plan that preserves jobs while improving profitability. I gripped the phone tighter. That sounds like a significant project. It is. 6-month engagement, full consulting fees, potential for extension if the initial phase goes well. The compensation would be substantial, probably more than you're currently earning from all your individual clients combined. Patricia named a figure that made me momentarily speechless. It was more money than I had ever imagined earning from my consulting work, enough to provide complete financial independence and establish me as a serious player in the regional business consulting market. I'd need to see your credentials and client references, of course, Patricia continued. But based on Jessica's recommendation and the work samples she shared with us, I'm confident you'd be an excellent fit for this project. When would you need an answer? I asked, my mind racing through the implications. We're hoping to start within the next month. Would you be available for an interview next week? Say, Tuesday afternoon in our Grand Rapids office. Yes, I heard myself say. I'll make myself available. After Patricia ended the call with details about the interview process, I sat staring at my phone in shock. This wasn't just another small business client. This was an opportunity to work with a prestigious firm on complex projects that would establish my reputation as a serious financial consultant. It was everything I had been building toward without even realizing it. But it was also impossible under the current circumstances. The timeline Patricia had mentioned would require me to be fully committed to the project, just as David was launching his new business. There was no way I could pursue this opportunity while also playing the supporting role that Margaret expected for David's venture. I had been planning to spend my lunch hour reviewing client files and preparing for afternoon meetings, but instead, I found myself driving to my Bay City office with my thoughts spinning in circles. The contrast between what Patricia was offering and what David and Margaret expected from me was so stark, it felt surreal. At Hoffman, Sterling & Associates, I would be valued for my analytical skills and strategic thinking. I would work on challenging projects that tested my capabilities and expanded my expertise. I would earn respect and compensation based on my professional performance, not my willingness to defer to other people's authority. In the Mitchell family plan, I would be David's supportive wife, networking at social events and entertaining potential clients. My business knowledge would be useful for understanding David's venture, but my primary function would be enhancing his professional image and managing the domestic responsibilities that supported his career. I thought about the way Patricia had spoken to me during our phone call, the assumption that I was a competent professional whose expertise was valuable enough to recruit for major projects. Then I thought about Margaret's lunch conversation, where my business activities were dismissed as little projects that needed to be scaled back when real family responsibilities required attention. The difference wasn't subtle. It was the difference between being seen as an autonomous professional and being seen as a dependent family member whose activities were tolerated as long as they didn't interfere with more important priorities. I spent the afternoon meeting with two of my regular clients, helping one prepare quarterly tax documents and working with another on cash flow projections for a potential expansion. Both meetings went smoothly, with clients praising my work and referring additional business owners who needed financial consulting services. As I locked up my office that evening, I realized that I had built something genuinely valuable over the past 3 years. My clients trusted my judgment, paid me well for expertise they couldn't find elsewhere, and recommended me to other business owners based on results I had delivered consistently. I hadn't inherited this success or married into it. I had created it through my own efforts, and it belonged to me in a way that nothing else in my life did. The drive home gave me time to consider my options, but I already knew what I was going to do. I couldn't give up the opportunity Patricia was offering, and I couldn't continue pretending that my business was just a hobby that could be abandoned whenever family obligations required it. David was waiting for me when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of documents and a bottle of beer. He looked up when I walked in, his expression a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "I've been thinking about the business opportunity all day," he said. "I actually drove over to look at some potential office spaces this afternoon." "Really?" "There's a perfect location downtown, right next to the architecture firm that Thompson & Associates runs. Great visibility, plenty of parking, and the rent is reasonable." David's enthusiasm was infectious. I could see having a showroom in the front for displaying renovation samples and materials, with design consultation areas in the back. I could picture exactly what he was describing, and I had to admit it sounded like a smart business concept. David had the knowledge and connections to make a renovation consulting firm successful, and his timing was good with so many people, investing in home improvements rather than buying new properties. "That sounds really promising," I said honestly. "The thing is," David continued, opening the folder to reveal financial projections and business plans, "I've been working on these numbers, and I think the opportunity is even bigger than I initially thought. If I can establish relationships with real estate agents and interior designers, I could position the business as a full-service renovation consultancy." He was clearly excited about the project, and his planning showed the kind of thorough thinking that suggested he would probably be successful. But as he talked about networking strategies and client development, I could hear Margaret's influence in his approach to building the business. "Mom thinks the key is establishing credibility with upscale clients right from the beginning," David said. "That means professional networking events, country club memberships, the kind of social positioning that shows potential customers we're serious players in the market." "That makes sense for your target demographic," I agreed. "Exactly. And that's where you'd be so valuable, Sarah. You understand financial planning and business operations, Plus, you have the social skills to help develop client relationships. We could be a real team. David was offering me partnership in his vision, but it was a partnership that required me to abandon my own professional identity to support his. He genuinely believed this was a generous offer, a chance for us to build something together that would benefit both of us. David, I said carefully, I got a phone call today that I need to tell you about. I explained Patricia's offer, watching David's expression change from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. When I finished describing the opportunity, he was quiet for a long moment. 6 months? He said finally. Initially, with potential extension if the project goes well. Sarah, that's exactly when I'd be launching the business. That's when I'd need your support the most. I know. David leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process the conflict between my opportunity and his plans. Can you postpone it? Explain that you have family obligations that prevent you from taking on a major project right now? This isn't the kind of opportunity that gets postponed, David. If I turn it down, they'll find someone else and probably never consider me for future projects. But our plans, David said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. We've been talking about building something together. This business venture could set us up for life. Your business venture, I corrected gently. This consulting opportunity could set me up for life. We stared at each other across the kitchen table, two people who had somehow arrived at completely incompatible visions of our future. David saw my opportunity as a betrayal of our partnership, while I saw his expectations as a demand that I sacrifice my career for his. I don't understand, David said finally. Why is your consulting work more important than our marriage? It's not about importance, I replied. It's about the fact that your version of our marriage requires me to give up everything I've worked to build. That's not true. I'm asking you to be my partner. You're asking me to be your assistant. There's a difference. David's face flushed with frustration. Sarah, this is a chance for us to build real wealth together. Your little consulting business, even with this new opportunity, is never going to provide the kind of security and status that my renovation firm could generate. The dismissive tone was so familiar I almost didn't register it at first. But then the words hit me fully, and I realized that David had been listening to Margaret's assessment of my work for so long that he had internalized her perspective completely. My little consulting business, I repeated slowly. I didn't mean it that way, David said quickly, but we both knew that he had. How did you mean it? David struggled to find words that could repair the damage, but it was too late. He had revealed what he really thought about my professional accomplishments, and his opinion aligned perfectly with his mother's dismissive attitude toward my independence. Sarah, you know I respect your work, he said weakly. Do you? Because everything you've said tonight suggests that you see my consulting practice as a hobby that should be abandoned the moment it conflicts with your real career goals. That's not fair, isn't it? I stood up from the table, suddenly needing distance from this conversation. David, when have you ever asked me for details about my client work? When have you shown genuine interest in my business challenges? Or celebrated my professional successes? David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. He had been politely supportive of my consulting work as long as it remained secondary to my role as his wife, but he had never seen it as something valuable in its own right. I support your work, he said finally. You tolerate my work, I corrected. Just like your mother tolerates it. As long as it doesn't interfere with your plans or challenge your authority, you're happy to let me play businesswoman in my spare time. That's not true. Then support my decision to accept Patricia's offer. The words hung between us like a challenge. David's face went through a series of expressions as he processed what I was asking him to do. I could see him trying to find a way to be supportive while still protecting his own interests. but the conflict was irreconcilable. "I can't," he said finally. "Sarah, this business launch is my chance to build something significant. I need your support, not your competition for time and attention." "My competition," I repeated, feeling something cold settle in my chest. "I didn't mean it that way either." "Yes, you did. And that's the problem, David. You see my success as a threat to your success instead of something we can celebrate together." David rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed by the direction our conversation had taken. "Sarah, what do you want from me? I'm trying to build a future for our family, and you're making it impossible by pursuing conflicting goals. I want you to see me as an equal partner instead of a supporting character in your life story." "I do see you that way." "No, you don't. Equal partners don't ask each other to give up their careers. Equal partners find ways to support each other's goals instead of demanding that one person sacrifice everything for the other person's dreams." We were quiet for a long moment, both of us recognizing that we had reached a fundamental impasse. David needed me to be someone I was no longer willing to be, and I needed him to see value in who I was becoming. Neither of us seemed capable of bridging that gap. "What happens now?" David asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm going to accept Patricia's offer." David's face went pale. "Even if it means I can't launch the business?" "You can launch the business, David. You just can't launch it with my unpaid labor supporting your success." "That's not what I was asking for." "Yes, it was. You were asking me to give up my career to enhance yours. That's exactly what you were asking for." David stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back in the process. "I need some air," he said, grabbing his jacket from the counter. "I'm going for a drive." After he left, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the domestic life we had built together over 8 years of marriage. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock, sounds that had provided the soundtrack to countless ordinary evenings when our biggest concern was what to watch on television. But ordinary wasn't enough anymore. I had tasted something different, something that engaged my mind and challenged my capabilities in ways that domestic routine never could. I had discovered that I was good at something important, something that other people valued enough to pay me well for my expertise. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. It was Margaret, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Sarah, David just called me. He's very upset about some consulting opportunity that's interfering with your family obligations." I took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I decided to accept Patricia's offer. "It's not interfering with anything, Margaret. It's a professional opportunity that I'm choosing to pursue." "At the expense of your husband's business launch?" "David's business doesn't require my participation to be successful. He's perfectly capable of building a renovation consulting firm without my assistance." Margaret's silence was ominous. When she finally spoke, her voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "Sarah, I think you've forgotten what it means to be married. Marriage is about supporting each other, making sacrifices for the greater good of the family." "I agree," I said. "What I don't understand is why all the sacrifices are expected to come from me." "Because David is the primary breadwinner. Because his business has the potential to provide real security for your future. Because that's how successful marriages work." "Maybe that's how your marriage worked, Margaret. But it's not how mine is going to work." The words were out before I could stop them, and I knew immediately that I had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. Margaret gasped as if I had slapped her. "I see," she said after a long pause. "Well, I think David deserves to know exactly where his wife's priorities lie. He already knows. I just told him. And I'll make sure he understands the implications of your choices." The threat was clear. Margaret was going to work on David, using every tool of guilt and manipulation she had developed over 38 years of managing her son's decisions. She would frame my professional success as selfishness, my independence as betrayal, and my refusal to conform as evidence that I was unfit to be a Mitchell wife. "You do what you think is best, Margaret. I'm going to do the same." I hung up the phone before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. I had just declared war on the most formidable opponent I had ever faced, a woman who had been controlling family dynamics since before I was born, but I had also done something I had never done before in my relationship with the Mitchell family. I had refused to back down, refused to apologize, and refused to accept that my goals were less important than their expectations. David didn't come home that night. I waited until nearly midnight before calling his cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to let me know he was safe, then went to bed alone in our house, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had just destroyed my marriage in pursuit of professional opportunities that might not even work out. The next morning brought a text message from David saying he had stayed at his parents' house and would be home that evening to figure out where we go from here. The formal tone was unlike him, and I suspected that Margaret had spent the night working on his perspective about our conflict. I drove to my interview in Grand Rapids that afternoon with a mixture of excitement and dread. The Hoffman, Sterling & Associates offices were everything I had expected: sleek, professional, and bustling with the energy of people engaged in challenging work. Patricia Hoffman was a sharp, confident woman in her 50s who asked intelligent questions about my experience and seemed genuinely impressed with my client portfolio. "Your work with Martinez Catering shows exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking we need for this manufacturing project," she said, reviewing financial statements I had prepared for Jessica. "You didn't just clean up her books. You identified strategic opportunities and created systems that support sustainable growth." The interview went better than I had dared to hope. Patricia introduced me to 2 other partners and the project manager who would be overseeing the manufacturing company engagement. They asked detailed questions about my methodology, my experience with different types of business challenges, and my availability for intensive project work. By the time I left Grand Rapids, I was confident that they would offer me the position. More importantly, I was energized by the prospect of working with people who valued my expertise and treated me as a professional equal. The contrast with my situation at home was stark and undeniable. David was waiting for me when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an expression I couldn't read. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept well, and older, somehow, than he had just 24 hours earlier. "How did the interview go?" he asked. "Well, I think they'll let me know by Monday." David nodded slowly. "And if they offer you the position?" "I'll accept it, even knowing what it means for us." I sat down across from him, trying to read his face. "What does it mean for us, David?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been thinking about it all night, and I honestly don't know how we move forward from here. We could start by accepting that we both have professional goals that matter." David shook his head. "It's not that simple, Sarah. This isn't just about careers. It's about what kind of family we want to be, what kind of life we want to build. Together." "What kind of life do you want to build?" "I want a partnership where we support each other's goals and work together toward common objectives. I want a marriage where we make decisions together instead of pursuing separate agendas that pull us in different directions." His words sounded reasonable, but I could hear the underlying assumptions that made them problematic. "David, have you ever considered that maybe the problem isn't that we have different goals? Maybe the problem is that your definition of partnership requires me to give up my goals to support yours?" "That's not what I'm asking." "Yes, it is. You're asking me to turn down a career-defining opportunity so I can help you launch your business. How is that different from asking me to give up my goals for yours?" David was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his expression was pained. "Sarah, do you still want to be married to me?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was the one question I had been avoiding asking myself, the one that cut through all the arguments about careers and family expectations to the heart of what was really happening between us. "I want to be married to someone who sees me as an equal," I said carefully. "Someone who values my success instead of seeing it as competition. Someone who supports my professional goals instead of asking me to sacrifice them for his convenience. Is that a yes or a no?" I looked at my husband, this man I had loved and tried to build a life with, and realized that I couldn't answer his question the way he wanted me to. The person he needed me to be and the person I was becoming were fundamentally incompatible. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if you can love the person I'm becoming, and I don't know if I can go back to being the person you fell in love with." David's face crumpled with an expression of loss and defeat. "So where does that leave us?" "I don't know that either. But I know I can't keep pretending that my goals don't matter, and I can't keep apologizing for being successful at something that has nothing to do with being your wife." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us recognizing that our marriage had reached a point from which it might not recover. The foundation we had built over 8 years was cracking under the weight of expectations that neither of us had examined clearly until now. "Maybe we should consider counseling," David said finally. "Maybe we should," I agreed, though I suspected that counseling would only make our fundamental incompatibilities more obvious. That night, we went to bed as politely distant roommates, lying on opposite sides of the mattress with an ocean of unresolved questions between us. I stared at the ceiling, knowing that by Monday morning everything would change. Either Hoffman, Sterling and Associates would offer me the position and I would accept it, officially choosing my career over my marriage, or they would reject me, and I would have to decide whether to return to my previous life or continue building my independence in other ways. But even if they rejected me, I knew I couldn't go back to being the grateful, compliant wife who deferred to Margaret's wisdom and supported David's goals without question. I had seen too much of who I could be when I wasn't trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. The person I was becoming was stronger, more confident, and more capable than the person I had been when I married David 8 years earlier. The question was whether our marriage could survive that transformation, or whether choosing authenticity would cost me everything I had built with the Mitchell family. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes everything seem sharper and more defined. I was reviewing client files at my college desk when my phone rang with the call I had been both anticipating and dreading. "Sarah, this is Patricia Hoffman. I hope I'm catching you at a good time." "Yes, absolutely. I'm pleased to offer you the consulting position we discussed." The partners were unanimous in their decision. Your analytical approach and client results impressed everyone we spoke with. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by a surge of excitement that felt entirely separate from my personal situation. This was validation of everything I had been building, confirmation that my skills had real value in the marketplace. "I'm honored and excited to accept," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Excellent. We'd like you to start Monday, November 1st. That gives you about 2 weeks to wrap up your current commitments and prepare for full engagement with the project." After Patricia outlined the contract details and logistics, I sat staring at my phone in something approaching disbelief. In less than 2 weeks, I would be working on complex financial restructuring for a mid-sized manufacturing company, earning more money than I had ever imagined possible, and establishing myself as a serious player in the regional consulting market. The contrast with my situation at home was stark. At Hoffman, Sterling and Associates, I would be valued for my expertise and treated as an autonomous professional. At home, I was still fighting for the right to make my own career decisions without family interference. That evening, I told David about Patricia's offer. He listened without interruption, his face carefully neutral, but I could see the resignation in his eyes. "Congratulations," he said when I finished. It sounds like an incredible opportunity. Thank you. So what happens now? I start November 1st. I'll need to give notice at the college and transition my current clients to other services or temporary arrangements. David nodded slowly. And us? It was the question I had been avoiding, the one that made all the professional excitement feel hollow and incomplete. I don't know, David. I honestly don't know. I talked to Mom. Again today, he said quietly. She thinks we should consider a trial separation while we figure out what we both want. The suggestion shouldn't have surprised me, but it still felt like a punch to the stomach. Margaret had maneuvered us into a position where my professional success appeared to be incompatible with my marriage, and now she was proposing a solution that would remove me from the family entirely. Is that what you want? I asked. I want my wife back, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I want the woman I married, who was excited about building a life together instead of pursuing separate agendas that tear us apart. That woman is still here, David. She's just not willing to disappear anymore to make other people comfortable. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we want different things from marriage, different things from life. We were both quiet for a long moment, recognizing that we had finally articulated the fundamental issue that had been destroying our relationship. We had different visions of what marriage should look like, different definitions of partnership, and different ideas about individual autonomy within a committed relationship. Maybe we do, I agreed sadly. 2 days later, David moved into the guest bedroom, and our house took on the hollow quality of a place where people were living separate, lives under the same roof. We were polite to each other, sharing meals and household responsibilities, but the easy intimacy that had characterized our marriage for 8 years was gone. Margaret called me directly on Thursday, her voice carrying the false warmth she used when she was implementing strategies she had planned carefully. Sarah, dear, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposal that might work for everyone. What kind of proposal? What if you took this consulting position as a short-term opportunity to gain experience, then use that experience to help David's business once it's established? You could build valuable skills while still prioritizing your marriage and family obligations. It was a clever approach, positioning my professional success as something that could ultimately benefit the family, while maintaining the assumption that my primary loyalty should be to David's goals rather than my own. That's an interesting idea, I said neutrally. The key would be setting clear boundaries from the beginning, making sure the consulting firm understands that this is a temporary arrangement, that your primary commitments are to your family. Margaret was trying to control the narrative around my career decision, framing it as a brief educational experience rather than a fundamental change in my professional trajectory. She was also testing whether I was still susceptible to her influence, whether the right combination of compromise and manipulation could bring me back into line. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I think I need to focus on doing the best job possible rather than setting artificial limits on my commitment. The silence that followed was cold and final. Margaret had offered me one last chance to accept her authority voluntarily, and I had declined. From this point forward, I would be treated as someone who had chosen to be outside the family's protective circle. I see, she said finally. Well, I suppose David will have to decide whether he can accept being married to someone whose priorities are so fundamentally different from his own. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was unmistakable. Margaret was going to work on David systematically, reinforcing every doubt he had about our marriage and my commitment to our family. She would frame my career success as betrayal and my independence as selfishness until he couldn't see any path forward except separation. That's David's decision to make, I replied. Yes, it is. And I think you'll find that he's stronger than you think when it comes to protecting his own interests. After Margaret hung up, I sat in my Bay City office reviewing the client files I would need to transition over the next 2 weeks. The work had given me purpose and confidence for 3 years, but now it felt like the foundation for something much larger and more significant. I called Jessica Martinez to let her know about my career change and help her find a replacement consultant for her ongoing needs. Her excitement about my success was genuine and infectious. "Sarah, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you," she said. "You've worked so hard to build your reputation, and now you're getting the recognition you deserve." The contrast with my family's reaction was painful but illuminating. Jessica saw my professional advancement as something to celebrate, while the Mitchell family saw it as something to manage and ultimately control. "I'll miss working with you," I told her honestly. "Are you kidding? You're going to be working on projects that make my little catering business look like a lemonade stand. This is your chance to show what you can really do." That weekend, David and I had the conversation we had both been avoiding. We were cleaning up after dinner, moving around each other with the careful politeness of people who were trying not to create additional conflict. "I've been thinking about what Mom suggested," David said finally, "about the trial separation." I stopped loading the dishwasher and turned to face him. "And? Maybe it would give us both some space to figure out what we actually want, instead of just fighting about what we can't have." "Is that what you want, David? Space to figure things out?" He leaned against the kitchen counter, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. "I want my wife to choose our marriage over her career. I want to build something together instead of watching you disappear into a life that doesn't include me." "I'm not disappearing. I'm growing into someone who has value beyond my relationship to you." "But what if that someone isn't compatible with being my wife?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everything we had been avoiding. What if the person I was becoming couldn't coexist with the person David needed me to be? What if 8 years of marriage had been based on assumptions about who we were that were no longer true? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know I can't go back to pretending that my goals don't matter. And I can't keep competing with your career for your attention and loyalty." We stared at each other across our kitchen, two people who had loved each other genuinely, but had somehow arrived at irreconcilable differences about what their life together should look like. "So what do we do?" I asked. "I think we should try the separation. Give ourselves 6 months to see if we can find a way to want the same things again." I nodded, recognizing that we had reached the point where separation felt like the only honest option. We couldn't keep living in the same house while pursuing completely different visions of our future. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I'll stay here. This is my family home, my community. You're the one who's choosing to leave." The accusation was subtle but clear. David was framing the separation as my choice, my abandonment of our marriage and community for selfish career ambitions. It was the narrative Margaret had been constructing, and he had internalized it completely. "I'm not leaving, David. I'm refusing to sacrifice everything I've built to support your version of what our marriage should look like." Same thing, in the end. I realized then that David would never be able to see our situation from my perspective. He genuinely believed that asking me to give up my career was reasonable, that supporting his business launch was more important than pursuing my own opportunities, and that my resistance to these expectations was evidence of insufficient commitment to our marriage. The following Monday, I gave notice at the community college and began the process of transitioning my clients to other consultants. My supervisor was disappointed to lose me, but supportive of my career advancement. Several professors asked if I would be available for occasional consulting projects, which I appreciated as validation of the work I had done there. Margaret's response to news of our trial separation was predictably supportive of David and coolly dismissive of me. She helped him look for a temporary apartment while making it clear that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings or included in family communications. David found a furnished apartment across town, close enough to the hardware store for easy commuting, but far enough from our house to feel like genuine separation rather than temporary inconvenience. The process of dividing our belongings was surreal. 8 years of shared life, reduced to conversations about who should take which kitchen appliances and photo albums. "What about the house?" David asked as we worked through the practical details. "It's in both our names. I can keep paying my share of the mortgage while we figure out what we're doing long term." "And if we decide to divorce?" The word hung between us like a door neither of us wanted to walk through but could no longer ignore. "Then we'll deal with that when we get there," I said. On my last day at the community college, I cleaned out my desk and said goodbye to colleagues who had become friends over the years. The work had been satisfying and stable, but I realized I had outgrown it completely. I was ready for challenges that would test my capabilities and opportunities that would allow me to see what I could accomplish when I wasn't limiting myself to fit other people's expectations. That evening, I sat alone in our house for the first time in 8 years. David had moved his clothes and personal items to his apartment, leaving behind empty closet space and the subtle absence that indicated a fundamental change in our living situation. The silence was profound, but not lonely exactly. It was the silence of possibility, of space to think and plan without constantly negotiating my choices with someone who saw my success as threatening to his comfort. I called my sister Emma in Chicago, the one person who had consistently supported my independence throughout my marriage. "Finally," she said when I explained the situation. "Sarah, I've been waiting for you to choose yourself for 8 years. It doesn't feel like choosing myself. It feels like blowing up my life." Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes you have to blow up the life that's too small for who you're becoming. Emma's perspective was both comforting and challenging. She had never understood my willingness to accommodate Margaret's expectations or David's assumptions about appropriate wifely behavior. To her, my career decision was long overdue rather than dramatically disruptive. "What if I'm making a mistake?" I asked. "What if I'm throwing away a good marriage for career ambitions that might not work out?" "Sarah, you've been married for 8 years to a man who doesn't support your professional goals and a family that sees your independence as a problem to be solved. That's not a good marriage you're throwing away. That's a limitation you're finally outgrowing." The next morning, I drove to Grand Rapids for my first day at Hoffman Sterling and Associates. The manufacturing company I would be working with was family-owned, third-generation business that had grown rapidly over the past decade, but was struggling with cash flow problems and operational inefficiencies that threatened their long-term viability. The project was complex and challenging, requiring analysis of everything from supply chain management to employee productivity metrics. I would be working with a team of experienced consultants, but I would have primary responsibility for financial restructuring recommendations that could determine whether the company survived or failed. It was exactly the kind of work I had been preparing for without realizing it. Every small business client I had helped over the past 3 years had taught me something about organizational dynamics, financial planning, and strategic thinking that was directly applicable to this larger project. Patricia introduced me to the rest of the team and walked me through the project timeline. The work would be intensive, requiring long days and frequent travel to the manufacturing facility. But the intellectual challenges were exactly what I had been craving. "We're hoping to have preliminary findings ready for presentation to the company's board by Christmas," Patricia explained. "If our recommendations are accepted and implemented successfully, there's potential for additional projects with related companies." As I settled into my new office and began reviewing the client files, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete professional engagement. This work required everything I had learned about financial analysis, strategic planning, and business operations. It was challenging enough to push my capabilities while building on expertise I had developed independently. The contrast with my situation at home was stark. At Hoffman, Sterling and Associates, I was valued for my competence and treated as an equal member of a professional team. My contributions were evaluated based on results rather than my willingness to defer to other people's authority. 3 weeks. Into the project, I received a call from David. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. "How's the new job going?" "It's challenging and exciting. The work is exactly what I hoped it would be." "Good. I'm glad it's working out." We talked for a few minutes about practical matters related to our house and finances, but the conversation felt stilted and formal. We were talking like acquaintances rather than people who had shared 8 years of marriage. "Sarah," David said finally, "I've been thinking about us, about what we both want from this separation. And I think we need to be honest about whether we're trying to save our marriage or just postponing the decision to end it." The question was fair, but painful. "What do you think?" "I think we want different things from life. I think you've changed in ways that make you incompatible with the kind of marriage I need." His words were measured and careful, but they carried the finality of someone who had made a decision after considerable thought. "Is that your way of saying you want a divorce?" I asked. "I think it might be the healthiest thing for both of us. We can stop pretending that we can find a compromise that works for everyone." The relief I felt was unexpected, and immediately followed by guilt about feeling relieved. But David was right. We had been trying to force a relationship that no longer fit either of us, and admitting that was probably kinder than continuing to struggle against incompatible expectations. "I think you might be right," I said quietly. "So where do we go from here?" "I guess we call lawyers and figure out how to untangle 8 years of shared life." The conversation was civilized and sad, but it felt honest in a way our interactions hadn't for months. We were finally acknowledging that our marriage had run its course, rather than continuing to blame each other for not being able to make it work. 6 months later, our divorce was finalized with minimal drama and fair distribution of assets. David launched his renovation consulting firm with financial support from his parents and quickly established himself in the local market. Margaret got the son back that she felt she deserved, free from the complications of a daughter-in-law who refused to accept appropriate limitations. I bought a small house in Bay City, close to my work, and far enough from Lakewood to feel like a complete fresh start. The house was nothing fancy, but it was entirely mine in a way that nothing had been since I was 16 years old. The manufacturing project exceeded all expectations. Our recommendations helped the company restructure their operations, improve cash flow, and position themselves for sustainable growth. The success led to additional clients and opportunities to work on increasingly complex projects. 2 years after my divorce, I was promoted to senior partner at Hoffman, Sterling & Associates. My client portfolio included some of the most challenging financial restructuring projects in the region, and my reputation for solving complex business problems had spread throughout the consulting community. I also reconnected with my sister Emma, who visited frequently and provided the kind of family support I had been missing for years. She never asked me if I regretted my choices or worried that I would end up alone. She simply celebrated my success and reminded me regularly that I had chosen authenticity over comfort, which she considered the bravest thing anyone could do. The Mitchell family occasionally appeared in local news articles about business developments or community events. David's renovation firm had grown successfully, and he had married a local woman whose family had deep roots in Lakewood. Margaret finally had the daughter-in-law she had always wanted, someone who embraced traditional roles and deferred to her expertise about family management. I felt no bitterness about their happiness. David deserved a wife who wanted the same things he wanted, just as I deserved the chance to build a life that reflected my own goals and values rather than other people's expectations. On quiet evenings in my Bay City house, I sometimes thought about the woman I had been when I married David 8 years earlier. She had been grateful for stability and belonging, willing to minimize herself to maintain acceptance from people who offered conditional love based on her compliance with their expectations. That woman had served her purpose, but she had also been holding me back from discovering what I was truly capable of achieving. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been liberating in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I had learned that I could support myself financially, that my professional skills had real value in the marketplace, and that I didn't need other people's approval to feel confident about my choices. Most importantly, I had learned that choosing authenticity over comfort was worth whatever it cost in terms of security and social acceptance. The phone rang one afternoon while I was reviewing proposals for a new client engagement. It was Jessica Martinez, calling to update me on her catering business and invite me to a celebration party for the opening of her second location. "Sarah, you have to come. None of this would have happened without the foundation you helped me build 3 years ago." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the work I had done with Jessica and other small business clients had created ripple effects I was still discovering. I had helped people build successful enterprises that employed others, contributed to their communities, and provided financial security for families. That evening, I walked through my neighborhood in Bay City, past houses where families were settling in for dinner and quiet evenings together. I felt no regret about choosing a different path, no longing for the domestic life I had left behind. I had chosen independence over security, professional growth over social acceptance, and authenticity over the comfort of conforming to other people's expectations. The choice had cost me my marriage and my place in the Mitchell family, but it had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I was capable of building a meaningful life on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia about tomorrow's client meeting. I smiled as I read her message, grateful for work that challenged me and colleagues who valued my expertise. This was the life I had been building without fully realizing it, one decision at a time, one small act of independence at a time. I was Sarah Chen now, not Sarah Mitchell. I was a senior partner at a respected consulting firm, a homeowner, and a woman who had learned that the most important approval I needed was my own. The family reunion where everything started felt like something that had happened to a different person entirely. That woman had been afraid to disappoint people who claimed to love her, but only accepted her on conditional terms. This woman knew better. She knew that real love supported growth rather than demanding limitation. That genuine partnership enhanced individual strength rather than requiring one person to diminish themselves for the other's comfort. Standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, reviewing my own successful business ventures, I realized that I had finally become the person I was meant to be all along. It had taken 8 years of marriage and a painful divorce to get here, but I had arrived at exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.